Okay. Kohila ma'am, shall we start?
Yeah, right.
Yes,
Shall
yes.
I?
Yes,
Okay.
please.
Ma'am, please turn on your video, ma'am, so that it will be easy for us to telecast it.
Okay,
Thank you,
okay.
thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much. Okay, ma'am.
Greetings and glad. Ma'am, shall I begin?
Yes, wait a minute. Baby ma'am, Pushpa ma'am?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, shall we start now?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes,
Sure.
okay. Yes, Kokila, you please.
Yeah. Greetings and glad welcome. We bring to the participants of the webinar Critical Theory in English Literature, organized by the PG and Research Department of English, V.O.Chidambaram College, Thuthukudi, re-accredited by NAC with A grade, and ranked 68th position at national level in NERF in 2020. Here, we pay tribute to our founder, Secretary, Kulapati Thiru APCV Veerabagu, for his dedication in bringing up this institution to the present elevated level. Dedicating his hard work, our present Secretary, Thiru APCV Chokkalingam, has also been a driving force in the development of the college, and our principal, Dr. C. Veerabagu, extends his immense support in all our academic efforts. With noble hearts, he is with us and for us. So, we are in this position to conduct this webinar at this presence. And the audience, your presence gives us encouragement. So, let us begin this seminar with welcome address. Now, I call upon Dr. P.D. Sylvia, Head and Associate Professor of English, V.O.Chidambaram College, Thuthukudi, to deliver her welcome address. Please, ma'am.
Yes. Revered Principal, dear colleagues from both our college and neighboring colleges, Speaker of the Day, Dr. Baby Pushpa Sinha, Professor of English, Assam University, and my dear students, good evening to you all. I find great pleasure in welcoming you all to the webinar Critical Theory in English Literature. I am much delighted to welcome our principal, Dr. C. Veerabagu, who is always our steering force in all our academic endeavors. Welcome, sir. I extend a very warm welcome to today's speaker, Dr. Baby Pushpa Sinha, Professor in English, Assam University, Sinha, Assam, who is here to throw light on critical theory in English literature. Welcome, ma'am. A very warm welcome to all the participants of this webinar, and my hearty welcome to all the learned fraternity for this seminar. And once again, I'll welcome one and all. Thank you.
Selvi Kokila, madam, please turn on your, unmute yourself, ma'am, please. Kokila, madam, please unmute yourself now.
Okay. So, can I continue now?
Yes, ma'am, you are good to go ahead.
Yeah. So, now, Dr. C. Chandramadi, Associate Professor of English, V.O.Chidambaram College, and convener of this webinar, will inspire and kindle the audience by introducing the resource person, Dr. Baby Pushpa Sinha, Professor of English, Assam University, Assam, to the virtual audience. Ma'am, please.
Thank you, Kokila. A warm good evening to all. Before introducing the resource person, I have to thank our Honorary Secretary, Sri APCV Chokkalingam, and our beloved Principal, Dr. C. Veerabagu, for their constant support and motivation. Now, it's my privilege to introduce today's resource person, Dr. Baby Pushpa Sinha. She is the Head and Associate Professor of English from Assam University. Her area of interest is 20th century American and British fiction. She is an erudite scholar and has produced a good number of research scholars. She has been the resource person for various national and international conferences. To her credit, she has published a quite number of articles and book chapters in national as well as international journals. She has also edited a book named Symphony, which is prescribed for the undergraduate students of colleges under Assam University. Ma'am, your presence is highly appreciable by all of us. And with these words, now I over to Kogila. Kogila, please.
Thank you, Sundaramati ma'am, for giving a brief introduction about the resource person. Now, to be inspired is great, but to be an inspiration is an art. Now, we have come to the integral part of this webinar. I now call upon our resource person, Dr. Baby Pushpa Sinha, Professor of English, Assam University, Assam, to deliver her special lecture. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.
So, good evening, everyone. I would like to express my heartfelt gratitude to the principal of V.O.Chidambaram College, and I'm also thankful to the patron of this college. And finally, I owe my regards to all the members of the organizing committee. And indeed, it is a great privilege for me to be a part of this evening's webinar. And I'm going to deliberate on a topic titled Critical Theory in English Literature. So I now begin my presentation. So we all know that literature is about life, or it is a reflection of life written from our personal experience, and also that we study literature in order to appreciate certain things. Now, let me quickly try to differentiate theory from literature briefly. So, literature is all about text and the narrative that the text tells us, whereas theory is all about how to read, how to understand the code, and also how to find a map for understanding in the text. So we can say that theory is a way into literature, and this may also be the difference between philosophers and literary critics, that is, between people who do philosophy and people who do theory. The theory might provide a reader some kind of, say, uh, ways into the literary text. It might give a reader a new map for understanding, but it is not the truth, and also it is not the heart of the matter. It is a tool or a weapon. Contrary to this, literature might give a reader a new way of seeing or viewing the world, which may change his or her entire perspective of understanding. And still,
Excuse me, ma'am. Sorry for the interruption. Do you have the presentation, ma'am? Excuse me, ma'am.
yes, sir.
If you have any presentation, you can share it on, ma'am.
Sir, as because I was not in the proper health, I just got vaccinated 2 days back, so I could not make the PPT.
Oh, okay, ma'am. No problem, ma'am. Just go ahead, ma'am. Sorry
Okay,
for the
so
interruption.
that way I will be
Doesn't
simply
matter.
reading.
Doesn't matter, ma'am. You please
Oh,
continue.
you please continue, ma'am.
Okay,
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so
okay,
much.
okay. Thank you. So the theory might provide a reader a new way into reading the literary text. It might give him a new map for understanding, but as I said, it is not the truth, and also it is not the heart or the crux of the matter. It is a tool or a weapon. So, contrary to this, literature might give a reader a new way of seeing the world, which may change his or her entire perspective of understanding. and still it does not give a reader a pattern or say design or a map.
சொல்லுமா சொல்லு
Critical theory
சொல்லுமா
articulates
சொல்லு
what we bring to
ஆமா இல்ல
literature,
இல்ல இல்ல இல்ல
which presumably determines what we get out of it. This is not a chaos of subjectivity.
சரி
Instead,
ஓகே
critical theory tries to examine what types of questions we should
மேம்
pose
எக்ஸ்கியூஸ் மீ
about
ப்ளீஸ்
literary
யுவர் வீடியோ
works.
turn off your video ma'am
Okay,
turn
okay.
on your video turn on
Yeah, it's
in a
turned on,
landscape
ma'am.
yes yes
It's
yes
it's it's turned on, ma'am.
not okay okay okay
Should I turn it off?
No, 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 ma'am. It's turned on only. If possible, please keep it in landscape mode, ma'am.
Okay, landscape mode. All right.
It'll be easy for us to telecast it on YouTube.
Okay.
Turn on your video and put it in landscape mode if possible, ma'am.
So is it okay now? Is it okay, sir? Now?
Kingston okay
Yes, ma'am. It's okay, ma'am. It's okay now.
okay okay ma'am okay
Okay. Okay, fine, fine. So critical theory articulates what we bring to literature, which presumably determines what we get out of it. So this is not a chaos of subjectivity. Instead, critical theory tries to examine what types of questions we should pose about literary works. Literary theory can also be identified as critical theory or simply theory. It is currently going through what we call change or say transformation into cultural theory within the discipline of cultural studies. So now we see that we don't have simply what we call say literature, or say we don't simply concentrate on what we call say literary studies only. The shift is now towards say cultural studies. So the steady progression or the steady paradigm shift is towards say cultural theory. So it can be understood as the set of concepts and intellectual assumption on which the act or task of explaining or interpreting literary text depends or say rests. Critical theory can be understood as an approach to social philosophy that lays emphasis on reflective assessment and critique of society and culture in order to reveal and challenge power structures. Some critics maintain that literary criticism is the practical application of literary theory because criticism usually deals directly with particular literary works, while theory may be more general or abstract. So we can say that critical theory is a movement in social and political philosophy. Drawing particularly on the thought of Marx and Sigmund Freud, critical theorists maintain that a primary goal of philosophy is to understand and to help overcome the social structures through which people are dominated and oppressed or say subdued or marginalized. So believing that science, like other forms of knowledge, has been used as an instrument of oppression, they caution against a blind faith in scientific progress, arguing that scientific knowledge must not be pursued as an end in itself without reference to the goal of human emancipation. Since the 1970s, critical theory has been immensely influential in the study of history, law, literature, and social sciences. On the other hand, literary theory is the body of ideas and methods we use in the practical reading of literature. By literary theory, we refer not to the meaning of a work of literature, but to the theories that reveal what literature can mean. Literary theory is a description of the underlying principles, one might say the tools, or say the weapons, or say instruments by which we attempt to understand literature. All literary interpretation draws on a basis in theory, but can serve as a justification for very different kinds of critical activity. It is literary theory that formulates the relationship between author and work. Literary theory develops the significance of race, class, and gender for literary study, both from the standpoint of the biography of the author and an analysis of their thematic presence within texts. Literary theory offers varying approaches for understanding the role of historical context in interpretation as well as the relevance of linguistic and unconscious elements of the text. Literary theorists trace the history and evolution of the different genres, narrative, dramatic, lyric, in addition to the more recent emergence of the novel and the short story, while also investigating the importance of formal elements of literary structure. So, hence, or say therefore, we make use of theoretical perspectives or framework uh, while we are doing, say, research, or while we are researching on a particular topic in a particular field. And we also make use of different theories, or say uh, theoretical approaches in order to interpret a text. So, literary theory, we can say, is the systematic study of the nature of literature and of the methods for literary analysis, whereas critical theory is not restricted and limited to literature alone. So, this is how we see that critical theory extends not only to literature, but it moves beyond. So, it extends its critical work to cultural and social life in its entirety. Before the advent of what we call critical theory or theories, we had what is known as liberal humanism, or say traditional literary criticism, or another word for liberal humanism could be the traditional approaches to the study of English literature. The term liberal humanism became current in the 1970s as a shorthand and mainly hostile way of referring to the kind of criticism which held sway before theory. So, before theory, we can say that we had what is known as liberal humanism, or when we fell in the grip of, or say when we fell under the clutches of theory, we came up or we started distinguishing what is known as liberal humanism. That is, liberal humanism was very predominant before the advent of what we call theory. So, the term liberal humanism, we can say, became current or became fashionable during the 1970s as a shorthand or as a way of referring to the kind of criticism which held sway before theory. So, the word liberal in this formulation roughly means not politically radical and hence generally evasive and non-committal on political issues. Humanism implies something similar. It suggests a range of negative attributes such as non-theoretical. So, when we say humanism, we basically try to mean something which is non theoretical. There is also the implication that liberal humanists believe in what we call human nature as something fixed and constant, which great literature expresses. So, when we go through the works of, say, Shakespeare or say other writers, we say that, or we get a notion or we get an idea that human nature is something that is fixed and constant. But then, when we go through literary text, we find that no, human nature is not something fixed, it's not something constant, it is subjected to, say, change. So, liberal humanists did not and do not, as a rule, use this name of themselves, but says an influential school of thought, if we practice literary criticism and do not call ourselves as Marxist critic or a structuralist or a stylistician or some such, then possibly we are a liberal humanist, whether or not we admit it or recognize this. All the difficulties we will have will be the direct result of the way theory is written and the way it is written about. So, the difficulties that we encounter in our day to day life while dealing with theory or while reading a book of theory is simply because the way it is written is very, very difficult. That is, the difficulties or the complications arise because of the language, because of the communication. So, all the difficulties we will have will be the direct result of the theory, the way it is written, and this happens because for literary theory, it must be emphasized or say it must be kept in mind that it is not innately difficult. Basically, it is not difficult. There are few inherently complex ideas in existence in literary theory. So, on the contrary, the whole body of work known collectively as theory is based upon some dozen or so ideas, none of which are in themselves difficult. So, what is difficult actually is the language of theory, and why the language of theory is different, or say why the language of theory is difficult, or why we find it difficult to understand, because many of the major writers writing on theory are French, so that much of what we read is in translation, sometimes of a rather clumsy kind. So, we often say that going through a book of theory is very difficult because the language is jarring. So, yes, we agree to some extent, but the difficulties arise not because the ideas are difficult. No, not at all. The ideas are okay, the ideas are ideas, and then the theorists they try to uh, get their ideas across. But the difficulty on the part of the readers is because the language is difficult, because most of the writers writing about theory are uh, or say many of the writers writing on theory are French. So, what we basically get to read and know is the translated version. So, we all know that uh, many things get lost in the act of translation itself, and hence the difficulties that we face arise when we are going through books of theories. So, when we are say dealing with theory or when we are going through books on theory, we should keep three things in our mind, and that is, firstly, we must have some initial patience with the difficult surface of the writing. We must avoid the too ready conclusions that literary theory is just meaningless, pretentious jargon. So, firstly, we should think that we should take it out from our mind, or the cobwebs regarding theory should be removed from our mind, and we should be, say, patient, and then we should uh, we should try to do away with the preconceived notions that we have about theory. That is, theory is jargon based, theory is full of ambiguities, theory is full of verbosity. So we should try to remove all these kinds of preconceived notions from our mind. So we should try to remove all these cobwebs. So I repeat this first point. So we must have some initial patience with the difficult surface of the writing. We must avoid the too ready conclusions that literary theory is just meaningless, pretentious jargon. That the theory is at fault. So we should try to remove all these things from our mind. Secondly, on the other hand, we must, for obvious reasons, resist the view that we ourselves are intellectually incapable of coping with it. That is, that we are at fault. So basically, what I am trying to get across is that we should not have any kind of preconceived notion when we are going through a book of theory. Thirdly, and crucially, or say most importantly, we must not assume that the difficulty of the theoretical writing is always the dress of profound ideas, only that it might sometimes be, which leaves the onus of discrimination on us. So, to sum up this attitude, we are looking in literary theory for something we can use, not something which will use us. So, we should be in a position to make use of something rather than uh, we being in a position to be used. So, something we can use and not something which will use us. So, we ought not to issue theory with a blank check to spend our time for us. And if we do it, it certainly will spend more than we can afford. We should not be endlessly patient with theory. Yes, some amount of patience is required, but then we should not be endlessly patient with theory. We should require it to be clear and expect it in the longer term to deliver something solid and concrete. We should not be content, as many seem to be, just to see it as challenging conventional practice or putting it in question in some never quite specified way. So, challenges are fine, but they have to amount to something in the end. In the name of challenges, we should not simply take things on face value, or we should not take things lying down. So, critical theory, in fact, long predates the literary criticism of individual works. So, in this context, we can say that the earliest work of theory was Aristotle's Poetics, which, in spite of its title, is about the nature or mechanics of literature itself. So, Aristotle's Poetics is the earliest work of theory, which is about the nature or mechanics of literature itself. Aristotle, Aristotle offers famous definitions of tragedy, insists that literature is about character and that character is revealed through action, and he tries to identify the required stages in the progress of a plot. He was also the first critic to develop a reader centered approach to literature, since his consideration of drama tried to describe how it affected the audience. So, Aristotle wrote or whatever Aristotle wrote regarding literature was reader centered or was audience centered, because he had at the back of his mind the satisfaction that reader would be having, because he thought that literature affected the audience or the readers. So his work was reader centric or say audience centric. Tragedy, he said, should stimulate the emotions like pity and fear. These being roughly sympathy for and empathy with the plight of a protagonist or say central character or hero. By the combination of these emotions came about the effect Aristotle called catharsis, whereby these emotions are exercised rather than expelled or driven out, as the audience identifies with the plight of the central character. The 1980s probably saw the high water mark of literary theory. So, during the 1980s, we see that people were all the time talking and discussing about literary theory. So, that decade was the moment of theory, or we can call it as the period of theory, when the topic called, say, theory was fashionable and also controversial, because people were finding it difficult to stomach the fact that they were, say, encountering something called theory, and they were completely shaken off from their comfort zone, because they before that they were simply focusing their entire attention on literature, and suddenly when theory came in, they were simply jolted. So they were finding it difficult to adjust themselves with this topic called theory, and then it created a whole lot of confusion. So it became a topic of discussion and debate, and it also became, this topic also became fashionable and say controversial. All the critical approaches are a reaction against something which went before, and a prior knowledge of these things cannot be assumed. Hence, it started with an account of what we call liberal humanism, against which all these newer critical approaches defined themselves. So, critical approaches or theories defined themselves against what we call liberal humanism. So, theorists like novelists are plentiful, and the subject of theory cannot succeed in classrooms unless we prepare it to be a student centered syllabus. We are rightly dismissive these days of the notion of teaching a great tradition of the novelists as advocated by the critic F.R. Lewis. So, in the name of theory, in the name of critical theory or literary theory, we find that F.R. Lewis's great tradition does not comfortably find a place in the curriculum or in the syllabus in the literary academia. So, but Lewis's great tradition was essentially a syllabus manageable within a year-long undergraduate course on the novel. And in order to understand F.R. Lewis's great tradition, at least it would require 1 year, and now in most parts of the country we are following what we call semester system. So it becomes difficult to go through, or it becomes difficult to complete the text, or it becomes difficult to complete, say, syllabus consisting of all these books and say the writers. So it is possible to read and adequately discuss a novel or two by Jane Austen, Eliot, James, Conrad, and Lawrence within that time. We need to make sure that what is presented as theory today, likewise, makes sense in teaching. So, we should always keep in mind that what we are thinking or what we are trying to present as theory should make sense in teaching. Otherwise, simply running after theory or simply doing theory just for the heck of it or just for the sake of it and not making a sense or not making a sense in teaching learning process will not be say a futile exercise. The conflict between liberal humanism and theory is a very, very fundamental one. But it is worth reminding ourselves that it is actually much older than the 1970s when it broke out with such force in Britain, America, and elsewhere. Similar debates and arguments took place in the 1930s, for instance, between F.R. Lewis, whom we might regard as the archetypal British liberal humanist, and the critical theorist called Rene Wellek. Lewis and Wellek debated the relationship between literary criticism and philosophy in the pages of Lewis's journal named Scrutiny. Wellek's point against Lewis was simply that practical criticism was not enough. He ought to spell out the theoretical assumptions on which his readings and his procedures generally were based. So, here we come across the viewpoints of, say, Rene Wellek and F.R. Davis. So, in Rene Wellek's view, a series of close readings of romantic poets in Lewis's book named Revaluations is offered to the reader in a theoretical vacuum. As he politely put it, and I quote, I could wish that you had stated your assumptions more explicitly and defended them systematically. I unquote. So, this refusal to accept the liberal humanist method as simply the natural and taken for granted way of doing literature is the crux of theory's general response to it. Though less politely than Wellek, theorists make the same demand as he did. Spell out what we do and why when we read and criticize literature so that our methods can be evaluated along with others. Now, I'll talk about critical theory further. So, the growth of critical theory in the post war period seems to comprise a series of waves, each associated with a specific decade and all aimed against the liberal humanist consensus which had been established between the 1930s and the 1950s. In the 1960s, firstly, these were two older but still unassimilated rival new approaches, these being Marxist criticism, which had been pioneered in the 1930s and then reborn in the 1960s, and psychoanalytic criticism, which was of the same vintage and was similarly renewing itself during the 1960s. At the same time, two new approaches were mounting vigorous direct assaults on liberal humanist orthodoxies, namely linguistic criticism, which came into being in the early 1960s, and early forms of feminist criticism, which started to become a significant factor at the end of the decade. Sydney was intent on expanding the implications of the ancient definition of literature, first formulated by the Latin poet Ovid, who had said that its mission is to teach by delighting or by entertaining. So we see that Sydney also quotes Horace to the effect that a poem is a speaking tree with this end to teach and delight. In English too, then critical theory came before practical criticism, as Sydney is writing about literature in general, not about individual works or writers, because Sydney was not writing about an individual writer, he was simply writing about literature as a whole. And Sydney also felt that the aim of literature is to uh, teach and delight, or is to instruct and delight. So he was also writing for literature as a whole and not writing about individual works or writers or authors. Literary theory after Sydney was significantly advanced by Samuel Johnson in the 18th century. So in the 18th century we see Samuel Johnson, and Johnson's Lives of the Poets and Preface to Shakespeare can be seen both as another major step forward in critical theory and as the start of the English tradition of practical criticism, since he is the first to offer detailed commentary on the work of a single author. After Johnson came a major blooming or development or growth of critical theory in the work of romantic poets, that is Wordsworth, Coleridge, Keats and Shelley. So after Johnson we get whole lot of these romantic poets making their days. So and they are the whole bunch of people like Wordsworth, Coleridge, Keats and Shelley. One of the main texts is Wordsworth's preface to lyrical ballads. So, what Wordsworth wrote in this preface was the product of a collaborative discussion between himself and Coleridge. And after the Romantics, the main developments in the critical theory were the work of mid and late Victorians like George Eliot, Matthew Arnold, and Henry James. George Eliot's critical work ranges widely over classical and continental writers and philosophical issues, as did Coleridge's. It is worth emphasizing this, since there are two distinct tracks in the development of English criticism. One track leads through Samuel Johnson and Matthew Arnold to T.S. Eliot and F.R. Lewis. This might be called the practical criticism track. It tends to center upon the close analysis of the work of a particular writer and gives us our familiar tradition of close reading. So, this practical criticism uh, gives us the opportunity of having what we call close reading, or say close analysis of say particular writers. And the other track lies through Sydney, Wordsworth, Coleridge, George Eliot and Henry James. This track is very much this track is very much ideas led rather than text led. So this is very much ideas centric rather than text centric. It tends to tackle big general issues concerned with literature, that is, how are literary works structured? How do they affect readers or audiences? What is the nature of literary language? How does literature relate to the contemporary and to matters of politics and gender? What can be said about literature from a philosophical point of view? What is the nature of the act of literary compositions? These track two preoccupations are very similar to the concerns of the critical theorists who became prominent from the 1960s onwards. And it is important to realize that these concerns are not an exotic imposition upon native Anglo American approaches to literature, but rather have been part of it from the beginning. And these different approaches each have their separate traditions and histories, but several ideas are recurrent in critical theory and seem to form what might be regarded as its common bedrock. Hence, it makes some sense to speak of theory as if it were a single entity with a set of underlying beliefs, as long as we are aware that doing so is an act of simplification. And some of these recurrent underlying ideas are, say, number one, many of the notions which we would generally regard as the basic givens of our existence, including our gender identity, our individual selfhood, and the notion of literature itself, are actually fluid and unstable things rather than fixed and reliable essences. Instead of being solidly there in the real world of fact and experience, they are socially constructed. That is, dependent upon social and political forces and on shifting ways of seeing and thinking. In philosophical terms, all these are contingent categories denoting a status which is temporary, provisional, circumstance dependent, rather than absolute ones, that is fixed, immutable, etc. Hence, no overarching fixed truths can ever be established. The results of all forms of intellectual inquiry are provisional only. There is no such thing as a fixed and reliable truth, except for the statement that this is so, presumably. The position on these matters which theory attacks is often referred to in a kind of shorthand as essentialism, while many of the theories discussed would describe themselves as anti essentialist. So, many of the theorists or theory, when we go through the critical theories, we discover that there cannot be what we call, say, absolute truth. There cannot be what we call permanent truth, because uh, they have gone up to the extent of saying that human nature itself is not fixed. Human nature itself is not constant. So, when human nature itself is not constant, when human nature itself is not fixed, how can we think or how can we even talk of truth which is absolute or which would be permanent? So, there is nothing called absolute truth. What we have is that truth is provisional. Truth is provisional. And number two is that theorists generally believe that all thinking and investigation is necessarily affected and largely determined by prior ideological commitment. The notion of disinterested inquiry is therefore untenable. None of us, they would argue, is capable of standing back from the scales and weighing things up dispassionately. Rather, all investigators have a thumb on one side or other of the scales. Every practical procedures, for instance, in literary criticism, presupposes a theoretical perspective of some kind. To deny this is to simply try to place our own theoretical position beyond scrutiny as something which is common sense or simply given. This contention is problematic, of course, and is usually only made explicit as a counter to specific arguments put forward by opponents. The problem with this view is that it tends to discredit one's own project along with all the rest, introducing a relativism which disables arguments and cuts the ground from under any kind of commitment. And the third point is language itself conditions, limits, and predetermines what we see. Thus, all reality is constructed through language, so that nothing is simply there in an unproblematic way. Everything is a linguistic or textual construct. Language does not record reality, it shapes and creates it, so that the whole of our universe itself is textual. Further, for the theorist, meaning is jointly constructed by reader and writer. It is not just there and waiting before we get to the text, but requires the reader's contribution to bring it into being. So, as far as the language or as far as reality is concerned, we can say, or the theorists believe that uh, reality is something that is constructed by language. So, reality itself is a linguistic construct, and uh, it's not that the meaning is before us or meaning is given to us, rather, we create what we call meaning. So, even the meaning is constructed by the reader. The text is before us, the text is there, and the text, after having been written, the author dies and the text is there, and the text cries for the reader so that the readers go through it and come up with its meanings. And the fourth point is, hence, any claim to offer a definitive reading would be futile. The meaning within a literary work are never fixed and reliable, but always shifting, always changing, multifaceted and ambiguous. In literature, as in all writing, there is never the possibility of establishing fixed and definite meanings. Rather, it is characteristic of language to it is a characteristic of language to generate n number of meanings, or what we call infinite webs of meaning, so that all texts are necessarily self contradictory. Why self contradictory? Because in one text, for example, I will go through a particular text. I will have my opinion. I will have my way of looking at it. I will have my set of assumptions. I will have my way of interpreting the text. And similarly, the same text, if you read it and if you have your own perspective, if you interpret it from your perspective, the meanings will definitely be different. So, the meanings of the texts can be contradictory depending upon the perspectives, depending upon the readers, or depending upon the interpreters. So, all texts are necessarily self contradictory, as the process of deconstruction will reveal. So, we can say that there is no final court of appeal in these matters, since literary texts, once they exist, are viewed by the theorist as independent linguistic structures whose authors are always dead or absent after having created their products, that is, the texts. And the fifth point that I would like to make here is that Theorists distrust all totalizing notions. For instance, the notion of great books as an absolute and self sustaining category is to be distrusted, as books always arise out of a particular socio political situation, and this situation should not be suppressed as tends to happen when they are promoted to greatness. So theorists they believe that there can not be any great books, or they feel that the notion of great books, the notion of great books should not be there, because every book, every text is the product of a particular social political situation, and uh, one particular situation should not be suppressed, because every socio-political situation is equally important. So, theorists are dead against the notion of great books. Likewise, the concept of a human nature as a generalized norm which transcends the idea of a particular race, gender or class is to be distrusted too, since it is usually in practice Eurocentric, that is based on white European norms. So, this notion that human nature is say Eurocentric, that is human nature is based on white European norms, it should also be distrusted. And androcentric, that is based on masculine norms and attitudes. So, human nature should not be Eurocentric as well as androcentric, that is based on masculine norms and attitude. Thus, the appeal to the idea of a generalized, supposedly inclusive human nature is likely in practice to marginalize or denigrate or even deny the humanity of women or disadvantaged groups. So, the idea like say androcentric or say Eurocentric should be distrusted, because when we think of these terms or ideas, say Eurocentric, that is white European norms or based on what we call white European norms, and androcentric, that is based on masculine norms and attitudes, it implies the subtle implication, or the subtle hint is that the humanity of women are being denied. So, such notions should be distrusted. So, I can sum up these points for theory by saying that politics is pervasive, politics is all around us, and language is constitutive. We constitute the reality with the help of language, and truth is provisional, that is, truth is not absolute, truth is not final, but it is provisional, and meaning is also not definite. Meaning is not certain, meaning is not definite, meaning is not permanent. So, we can say that meaning is contingent, and human nature is not constant, human nature is not permanent. So, we can say that human nature is a myth. So, with these words, I would like to bring my presentation to a close. Thank you, one and all. Now, over to the organizing members.
Okay,
Thank you,
thank you,
ma'am.
ma'am.
This was really a wonderful session, and your deliberation has reiterated the importance of critical theories in interpreting any work of art. And we also come to know that it is a collective assessment and critique of society where the power structure proves to be a challenge. And excellent was your delineation of literary theories in different eras. And the most interesting thing is you pointed out the difficulties in understanding the theories, and you also gave remedies so that hereafter the students, that is the participants, would follow your ideas while studying critical theory. So, in short, if I have to say, it is really an amazing lecture, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. Hello?
Ah, Kokila.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. Now we have almost come to the end of this webinar. Before ending this webinar, I would like to make an announcement to the participants. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, that is V.O.C. Uh, YouTube channel. And if you have already subscribed, thank you so much. If not, please subscribe for the YouTube channel. Now, we have come to the most important part of this seminar, that is gratitude bestows reverence, allowing us to encounter revelation. So, I request Dr. R. Mercilata, Associate Professor and co-convener of this webinar, to propose vote of thanks. Over to Dr. Mercilata.
Good evening to all. At the outset, I thank our Honorary Secretary, Sri A.P.C. Vichokulingam, for providing us moral support in all activities. Our thanks are due to our principal, Dr. C. Veerabahu, who encourages and kindles our interest in many activities of the college. Our sincere thanks are to the resource person, Dr. Baby Pushpa Sinha, for her deliberations on critical theory in literature. We heard that she is indisposed. Ma'am, despite her indisposition, you have made it a point to enlighten us today. We thank you so much for being with us. Thank you, ma'am. We extend our sincere thanks to Dr. Ratika, Coordinator, UGC Stride at V.O.Chidambaram College, and Dr. John Prince Soundaranayagam, Coordinator, IQAC, V.O.Chidambaram College, for providing us all support for the live streaming of this program on YouTube. We extend our sincere thanks to our department members who shoulder all our responsibilities. Our thanks are due to Mr. Gomati Nayakam, HOD, Department of Computer Science, and Mr. Kingston, Assistant Professor, Department of Commerce, for their technical assistance. Our heartfelt thanks are to all the participants, the faculty members of various colleges, scholars, and students for their active participation. Once again, we thank one and all. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so
Thank you,
much.
ma'am. Baby Pushpa Singh. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you
It
so
was a
much, ma'am.
pleasure.
It's a
It was
wonderful
a pleasure
presentation, ma'am.
talking to you
Yes,
all.
and
Thank
critical,
you.
right. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. Okay.
Thank
Thank
you.
you,
Okay,
ma'am.
okay. Selvi Kogla, thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.
Okay,
Thank you. Thank you.
okay. Kingston,
சொல்லுங்க மேம்.
வெளியில வா. வெளில வந்துடலாமா? Shall we leave? Okay, bye. Thank you.